Welcome to Context. I'm Brad Harris. Quick note at the top here. I'm trying to keep Context free of ads, which means the show depends entirely on direct listener support. The best way to help is to join me on patreon.com/Brad Cole Harris or subscribe through Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Leaving a 5-star rating wherever you listen also makes a big difference. It boosts visibility and helps new listeners discover the podcast. Okay, we have a lot to discuss. Imagine you wake up tomorrow to find the supermarkets stripped. Not by panic buyers, not by a trucker's strike, but because the harvest itself failed. Everywhere. Governments open grain reserves and discover they amount to weeks, not months. Livestock is slaughtered for lack of feed. Bakeries close, prices spike. Quiet neighborhoods simmer into fear. Facing such a catastrophe, we might instinctively suspect the usual culprits: war, drought, disease. But this time, the spark that's causing our civilization to blow up so suddenly is much more mundane. A single industrial process, one almost no citizen can name, has faltered. And within a season, the entire world threatens to come apart. The process is called Haber-Bosch. It takes nitrogen from the air and forces it through heat and pressure and iron and scientific genius into ammonia. That ammonia is turned into fertilizer, and that fertilizer props up roughly half the calories humans eat on this planet. Remove it, and modern abundance collapses back into pre-industrial scarcity. But here's the really uncomfortable truth. Most people don't just take this for granted. They don't even know it exists. And that ignorance isn't a trivial oversight. It's emblematic of a broader cultural condition, one in which the modern systems that keep us alive recede so far into the background that we cease to notice them at all. We've become like passengers on a ship whose engine room we never visit, sailing by blind faith that the vibration beneath our feet will just continue. This episode is about that engine room, about the fundamental infrastructure of modern abundance, and what we risk when we forget it is there. And to understand it, we'll start with one of its most indispensable gears, the global food supply. Strip away the trucks, the silos, the grocery stores, and you're left with the oldest equation in civilization: plants, soil, and the nutrients that pass between them. Chief among those nutrients is nitrogen. Plants cannot grow without it. The air is full of nitrogen, but in a form they can't use. For most of human history, the only way to replenish nitrogen in the soil was slow. Manure, compost, legumes that harbor bacteria capable of fixing nitrogen, and lightning's rare gift. In that case, when a lightning bolt strikes, the extreme heat and energy break the strong triple bonds holding atmospheric nitrogen molecules together. The freed nitrogen atoms combine with oxygen to form nitrogen oxides, which dissolve in rain and fall to the ground, adding a small amount of plant-available nitrogen to the soil. In any case, for all of human history until a little over a century ago, agricultural yields rose by attention and craft and patience. They fell by weather, war, or neglect. Famine was not an anomaly of mismanagement. It was ordinary. By the 1840s, the German chemist Justus von Liebig articulated academically what farmers already knew commonsensically. Soil fertility depends on mineral inputs, with nitrogen the chief constraint. Europe responded by importing nitrogen as if it were treasure. Guano, compressed bird droppings rich in nitrates, was mined on Pacific Islands and shipped by the cargo hold. The United States passed the Guano Islands Act in 1856, allowing Americans to claim uninhabited deposits on behalf of the Republic. In South America, the War of the Pacific between 1879 and 1884 turned in part on control of vast nitrate deposits across the deserts of Chile. Nations fought over bird waste because they were, in a literal sense, hungry for it. The Czech-Canadian scientist and policy analyst Václav Smil, known for his wide-ranging work on energy, environmental change, population, food production, and technological innovation, published a book in 2001 titled Enriching the Earth, which showed how close the world ran to a biological ceiling by the turn of the 20th century. Human populations had grown with better sanitation and trade. Urbanization pulled labor off the land. The best manures and rotations were wrung hard. Without a new source of fixed nitrogen, however, that arithmetic no longer worked. A crisis loomed. Yet, at the dawn of the 20th century, science still had a reputation for delivering miracles. Not the thin, incremental upgrades we associate with innovation today, but genuine civilizational pivots. Within a single lifetime, the electric light had banished night from city streets. The internal combustion engine had collapsed distances. The germ theory had begun to turn fatal diseases into manageable threats. Chemistry was not just producing better dyes and metals. It was beginning to tamper directly with nature's own cycles, raising the possibility of solving problems that had constrained humanity for millennia. It was an age when a breakthrough at the laboratory scale could alter the fate of nations, and when a scientist working with glass tubes and stopcocks might, quite literally, change the terms of human survival. Into that atmosphere, and under the shadow of a nitrogen crisis, stepped Fritz Haber, a German chemist with a reputation for brilliant but often controversial ideas. In 1909, he ran a tabletop experiment that had defeated chemists for decades. He coaxed inert atmospheric nitrogen to bond with hydrogen, producing ammonia. The equation was simple, but the reality was not. Nitrogen was famously stubborn. Its triple bond resists. Haber's breakthrough was finding the right conditions, heat, pressure, and a catalyst to make the reaction go. Haber's laboratory success, however, was still a long way from feeding the world. Producing ammonia in a glass apparatus was one thing. Producing it by the ton, reliably and safely, was quite another. The pressures and temperatures required were extreme, enough to rupture the best steel of the day. The reaction chamber had to withstand continuous operation without leaking any hydrogen. This was the challenge that drew in Carl Bosch, a young chemical engineer at BASF. Methodical and relentless, Bosch approached the problem not as a chemist chasing a reaction, but as an engineer building a system, one that could be scaled from the precision of a lab bench to the roar of an industrial plant. Bosch's charge was to scale Haber's finicky little reaction into a continuous industrial process. That meant designing reactors that would hold together under punishing pressures, engineering new steel that wouldn't become brittle, developing catalysts that wouldn't self-destruct, solving how to feed in gases and draw off ammonia safely, and doing all of it not once, but relentlessly, hour after hour, day after day. He did it. And Bosch's engineering solutions turned Haber's fragile laboratory reaction into the continuous industrial process the world needed. By 1913, BASF had constructed the first full-scale Haber-Bosch plant, capable of producing ammonia by the ton. It was an achievement that required not just chemical insight, but metallurgical innovation, precision manufacturing, and a relentless commitment to solving practical problems that no one had confronted before. From there, the implications were immediate and profound. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer could now be produced year-round in quantities unimaginable only a decade earlier. Crop yields rose. Famines that had haunted every generation in recorded history began to recede. Within a few decades, the Haber-Bosch process would underpin the agricultural revolutions that fed a rapidly growing global population, reshaping the human condition in ways so sweeping that most people alive today have never known the older, much more precarious world it displaced. Without synthetic nitrogen, the world today would feed billions fewer people. That we find such a sentence kind of mundane is itself evidence of how thoroughly we live inside its truth. So, the technical feat is one story. The cultural consequence is another. For millennia, farmers' skill included a practical intimacy with the limits of their land. They knew the smell of a field ready to take seed and the exhaustion that followed a run of bad weather. They understood that soil fertility, like virtue, required habits. The soil was not some input in their equation of survival. They maintained a relationship with it. Haber-Bosch did not erase that relationship, but it transformed its terms. Once ammonia became cheap and abundant, nitrogen could be applied like a commodity, metered and forecasted, dropped in precise doses. The craft of replenishment, which once lived in the pattern of rotations and the economy of manure, shifted toward the logic of supply and demand. Yields rose, lifespans lengthened, and the human population exploded. All good things, especially coming out of a long stretch of history dominated by frequent famine. But awareness of the old bargain faded. Nowadays, the average citizen in modern economies lives entirely removed from the land. Food is simply there in the store. Meat is shrink-wrapped on styrofoam trays, bread is bundled in plastic, all laundered of the contingency of nature. The industrial triumph that fixed nitrogen also unfixed humanity's ancient agricultural memory. The cultural consequences of this forgetting have not gone unnoticed. The American media theorist and cultural critic Neil Postman, best known for his works like Amusing Ourselves to Death, published in 1985, and Technopoly, published in 1992, spent much of his career warning about the ways technology reshapes thought and culture. In his book, Technopoly, he described a social order in which tools cease to be tools as such and become the entire environment. In a technopoly, we do not count ourselves as using a system. We simply live inside it, like air. And so the machinery of modern abundance just becomes the background. It disappears. Now, that forgetfulness is not universal, of course. Farmers still reckon with the seasons. Engineers still climb inside the machines that keep us alive. But culturally, publicly, politically, the stories we tell about our lives and the things we pay attention to these days rarely include the infrastructure that underwrites all of this. The result is a citizenry that can talk at length about entertainment and tastes and identity, but struggles to name a single component of the industrial foundation that makes any of that possible. Part of the problem is just inescapable. Modern systems are very complex. No one mind really grasps the totality of a power grid or a global shipping network. We manage complexity by slicing it up into disciplines and firms and specialized dashboards. That's both the power and the price of modern specialization. Specialization alone doesn't explain our detachment, though. There's also the way complexity is translated, or rather flattened, so that large systems can be administered and consumed without overwhelming the people who depend on them. Governments, corporations, and engineering firms have always relied on shorthand to manage scale. The modern world reduces its most intricate systems to single, seemingly self-explanatory words: power, shipping, fertilizer. Behind each label lies a cathedral of interlocking parts. but the label subsumes the thing itself. So, for most of us, food just arrives. It is simply there on the supermarket shelf, without any sense of the long chain behind it. Seeds selected and planted, soil chemistry balanced, fields watered, pests managed, crops harvested, sorted, stored, shipped, stocked. Or take electricity, it just flows. But beneath the flip of the switch lies a continent spanning network of turbines, transformers, transmission lines, balancing authorities, maintenance crews, fuel supply chains. These shorthand labels for how modern life works are serviceable maps for daily life, but they're dangerously incomplete. And the more comfortable we get with the labels standing in for the reality, the easier it is for our awareness to harden into indifference. And when the system stumbles, our indifference will be a poor defense. Consider the 2003 blackout that rolled across the northeastern United States and Canada. A tree in Ohio brushed a transmission line. Software failed to alarm. Operators missed the cascading overload. Within minutes, 50 million people had no power. Water plants faltered, traffic lights died, commuter rails froze in place. It was like that scene from The Day the Earth Stood Still, when Gort neutralizes power all over the world. Pure chaos ensued. The grid is a masterpiece of continuous balancing, and because it usually works, we scarcely even register it as a thing until it breaks. Or take the 2021 wedging of a single container ship in the Suez Canal. One vessel, sideways, interrupted roughly a tenth of global trade. Shelves didn't empty across the West, but delivery times stretched, inventories thinned, and a word, fragility, briefly pierced the fog of normal. The shipping container, like the molecule of ammonia, is a small, standardized miracle that makes the vast machinery of global trade seem inevitable. And that parallel points to the deeper truth. These are not isolated marvels, but variations on a single pattern. Modern civilization runs on hidden systems, from container ports to power grids to ammonia plants, whose reliability is so complete that they vanish from public thought. We only notice them in the instant they falter, and by then, it's too late to improvise. Our dependence on them is not just practical, it's structural. Remove one, and the shock ripples outward until it touches everything. A society that can coerce the sky into feeding the soil has acquired real power. But power reshapes dependence. Remove the ammonia, and modern agriculture doesn't slow, it seizes. In a pre-industrial village, a bad harvest meant hunger, but not universal collapse. The knowledge and the practices, however limited, still lived among the people. In an industrial society, the failure of a core input can cascade across continents because the skill to improvise was traded long ago for the machinery that made improvisation unnecessary. The benefits of modern industrial systems like Haber-Bosch are beyond dispute. Yet the costs are real. And towering over all of the externalities is the structural vulnerability of our utter dependency itself. The fragility of all of this is actually quite shocking when you really think about it. Because, really, what would you do if the supermarket actually went empty and was never restocked? What would you do if the electricity stopped flowing and there was no official plan or mechanism still intact to turn it back on? The modern world can't go back to some pre-industrial mode of feeding 8 billion people. And the question is not how to rediscover some 19th century version of rugged independence or how to stock your doomsday bunker well enough to weather civilization's collapse. The question is how to preserve widespread human understanding of these large and complicated modern systems. And yet, the more pressing this becomes, the more we seem to be moving in precisely the opposite direction. With the rise of artificial intelligence, we're not just outsourcing mechanical skill, we are beginning to outsource our capacity for thought itself. Tasks that once required human beings to wrestle with the details, form judgments, to understand enough of a process to make it work, are now being delegated to systems whose inner workings we neither control nor comprehend. AI is increasingly designing not just our machinery, but the conceptual tools to build it, all the way down to the mathematical substrate. And in doing so, it tempts us to surrender the very habits of mind that make stewardship possible. We may come to see thinking itself as a service, delivered instantly and invisibly, just like the electricity in the socket or the food on the store shelf. And as with every other hidden system, the less we understand it, the less prepared we will be to question it, repair it, or replace it when it fails. This is the same pattern we've been tracing from the Haber-Bosch process to the shipping container. The more powerful and invisible the system, the easier it is to treat it as a permanent feature of the landscape, until one day it isn't. The difference with AI is that it doesn't just run the engine room, it designs it and may very well begin to decide where the ship is going. In that sense, as I've started saying a lot more on the show, the stakes are higher than ever. What would it mean for at least a critical mass of us to continue to remember how to build the modern world? It wouldn't require every citizen to become a farmer engineer, but we could revive a civic expectation of practical literacy, an education that includes how water is made clean, how power gets to a house, why ammonia matters, not to produce specialists, but to produce adults. We could demand a politics that treats infrastructure as the hard center of civilization rather than a talking point. To govern modern prosperity in an age of artificial intelligence will be, in no small part, to keep the engine room well stocked with intelligent and industrious human beings. We could cultivate a culture that honors mechanical competence and blue-collar grit. The person who keeps a wastewater plant humming should get nearly the same respect as a decorated soldier, and certainly far more than most PhDs. And this brings me back to where we began. If Haber-Bosch vanished tomorrow, famine would follow. Now, that sentence should focus our minds not on panic, but on gratitude and on responsibility. The remedy for cultural amnesia is not nostalgia. It is the responsibility of our society to prioritize those who understand how the system that feeds us and warms us and connects us actually works. Modern civilization is not a miracle. It is a maintenance schedule. And so, the first task on the list is to remember that it exists. I'm Brad Harris. So long.